Greetings. Welcome to Atlanta. I'm here from the Internet Governance Project at Georgia Tech, and see some familiar faces here. I'm giving you now something completely different, as Monty Python used to say, talking more about public policy and geopolitics than about technology, but of course the two intersect quite a bit. Next slide. No, I've got this. Very good. So some of you may have noticed that just a few days ago, the U.S. government made an announcement definitively attributing the NotPetya malware to Russia. And of course, Russia denies that, and there's still some debate among certain members of the technical community as to whether that attribution is accurate. But we all know that the U.S. and Russia are enemies, and it makes a lot of sense for the U.S. to see Russia as the culprit. Now, attribution is important because it is the first step towards making entities accountable in cyberspace. A growing number of cyber attacks, certainly the most important and potentially destructive ones, are coming from nation states. And this is interesting because in domestic world, governments are supposed to be the source of law and order. Now, one of the things we have to recognize about the attribution process is just how disorganized it is. We just noted that the U.S. made a public attribution through some kind of an official announcement. Sometimes that happens. Sometimes, one time, the U.S. government made an attribution by putting an op-ed piece in a public newspaper. At other times, it leaks the attribution to the media, and sometimes it releases a formal statement, or it only makes the attribution in private dialogues. In addition to this, you have multiple private sector security firms that make their own attributions, and these are actually good contributors to the process in the sense that they're doing research. But again, it's somewhat disorganized. They invent different names for the same incidents, the same groups, and the same malware, and they have debates among themselves in public about who is right and how strong the evidence is, but we have no common metric for assessing the confidence with which they're making an attribution. Fundamentally, I think attribution processes are disorganized primarily because we are relying so much on state actors to make them. And state actors are really as much a part of the problem as they are a part of the solution. Governments could be the wrong institutions to be making critical attributions. They are biased. Their sources and methods are not transparent. And attribution can be used strategically to further their foreign policy or military ends. So cyber attribution, typically by governments, it really gets distorted by geopolitics, and evidence will not be transparent because they won't want to release it. So what's the solution? This is going to be a little bit simplistic, but just to get the dialogue started, we think the solution is institutional, not so much technical. It's not like there isn't good attribution technology and techniques out there. The problem is more one of credibility and process and neutrality. Attribution is more than forensic science and technology. It's about transparency and uniform methods. It's more like a court proceeding than a lab experiment. The science and technology of attribution must be supplemented by the creation of fair and independent processes. And for these processes to be fair and independent, I'm arguing that they need to be independent of states, governments. So Microsoft Corporation was the first to actually float this idea in their so-called Digital Geneva Convention idea. That idea of a Digital Geneva Convention has gotten mixed up with a formal intergovernmental treaty, which means that a lot of people don't like that idea, including me. But the idea of an international attribution organization, which they also proposed, is completely separate from this Digital Geneva Convention idea. And the RAND Corporation was commissioned by Microsoft to study the feasibility And they proposed a global cyber attribution consortium that would work with victims on their request to investigate cyber incidents in which state actors are suspected. They propose that the membership come from technical experts and the industry and from cyberspace policy experts. They said there should be no formal representation of nation states and that they should try to standardize their different methodological approaches, naming conventions, and confidence metrics. Well, I think that's all a very good idea, and I think that we need to start talking about this, and I'm really interested in the reaction that we're going to get from the network operators that are represented at this conference. So at that stage, I will open it to questions. I realize, by the way, there are unanswered questions about this idea, like how do you fund such an institution and how does the funding maintain its neutrality? What would be the incentives of key actors to create this institution? What kinds of globally shared attribution infrastructure would be required? That's some interesting questions that I'm exploring with some computer science colleagues at Georgia Tech. And if you do attribute, will it actually affect the behavior of states? That's still something of an open question. So, look forward to your comments about the idea of an international attribution organization. Thank you.
Will McClendon, Layer 3 Communications. Thought just occurred to me on funding. What about the idea of any time a botnet goes off that is attributed to a certain manufacturer of that device, basically pays a penalty to fund the research that tracks them down to shut them down. So if they don't produce shoddy equipment, if you get rid of one problem, the other one at least partially goes away.
Well, that's basically a product liability approach to cybersecurity, and there are arguments for and against that. I'm actually not hostile to that idea, but I don't really think it really solves the problem that I'm talking about. So there are always going to be vulnerabilities, and as long as state actors are behind them, the question of who you attribute it to and how you engage in deterrence and a response and retaliation is still going to be an open one. So I still think we're going to need some kind of a neutral and independent attribution agency. Next.
Hi, I'm Paul. I was born in Russia, so Russia is not an enemy. Although you made that statement, to be fair to all the people that were born in Russia, everyone is a friend, and there are bad people and there are good people, and there are less bad people out there. As per the attribution, let's say I'm on my computer and I did the hack and I want to bring the entire critical infrastructure of the United States down to its knees. I'm an American. So first of all, how would you attribute something to a lone wolf? And why it suddenly becomes suddenly all the Iranians, scientists, become sort of popular because companies like CrowdStrike post their pictures online and say they did it.
Okay, first of all, I did not say Russia was an enemy. I said the United States government just had fingered Russia as responsible for NotPetya. In effect, although I wasn't explicit about it, I was expressing skepticism about that attribution and saying that, who knows? And that's precisely my point about having this neutral agency, is that you can't trust nation states to make attributions about nation states that they perceive as enemies. And of course, Russia is never going to admit that they did it, but it might be better to have a more neutral and independent agency saying, we've investigated this carefully, and a lot of people have participated, and they're not biased by the US, and yes, we think Russia did it, or no, we think Russia didn't do it. I think that would be a valuable thing. There's another element to your question that I've... lone wolf, yes. So when I talk about this kind of an attribution organization, I'm talking about state actors only. So if this lone wolf is in the United States, then I do trust the FBI or the law enforcement agencies of the US government to make to go about the process of making an attribution to this lone wolf fairly and objectively, because their incentives are there to do so. They want to find out who did it. They want to stop that person. They want to catch that person. It's when we have interstate conflict that I think we have a bit of a problem here. So, you know, the stickier question is, suppose this lone wolf is somehow acting as an agent for a foreign state, but that person is an American, then you get into some interesting questions there.
So I would follow up on the following thing, is each government is restricted in terms of its jurisdiction. So when someone would perform an attack, they would likely cross jurisdictional boundaries. And this means that you have to have international cooperation when addressing those concerns. And that would be problematic unless you have a consent, basically an effort by multiple nations all together and not an independent body.
Well, the independent body might be used by the nation states as an objective source of attribution, but indeed, for non-state actors, you know, your common cyber criminals, there is already a lot of cooperation among nation states for catching people. It's complicated, it's costly and difficult, but it does happen. There's a bunch of questions over here.
Yeah, so Warren Kamari, Google. So I'm generally supportive of the idea, because whenever you hear sort of an attribution from a nation state, wow, there's a bad echo. Whenever you hear an attribution from a nation state, you kind of automatically don't trust it, because you assume that there's some sort of bias behind it. But I think it will be really hard to set up something which isn't also going to get accused of bias, right? These are big, important people fighting about big, important things. The obvious thing is they'll just say whatever this thing is biased against, you know, and that will move back and forth depending on what they don't like.
That's exactly what I was getting at here. If we're going to try to do this, we need to think carefully about the design of this institution and how we could avoid those problems. And probably it would have to achieve this credibility over time by doing things that people started to trust. It would not instantly have trust simply because it was created.
Yeah, I mean, sort of a follow-on from that is things like, you know, the standard example is the Sony North Korea attribution. When one tries to get more information about that, you generally hear, it's all secret, we can't tell you. So I think another problem will be this organization getting access to data to actually be able to validate any claims will be entertaining. But who knows?
Yeah, that's a critical question, this transparency of evidence. I'm not sure how we handle this. We've got 4 questions over here. I'll let the moderator decide.
Okay, I guess I'll just ask the question. Chris moves down fastly. So it's a follow-up on actually what Warren said. If we create this and...
sorry. We have one more talk. You are welcome to follow Milton in the hallway.
Okay.
We just want to try and keep on schedule, so I do apologize. Do want to say thank you for the speed. Thank you, guys.
Thanks.